At a meeting, my ex and her husband stormed in. "We want half of your $500 million company," she demanded. I said, "You are not getting anything." The next morning, they boasted. "We burned your company down." I rushed over, and I laughed. The building they torched was actually a stranger's. I was Lewis, 34 years old, running an empire I hadn't asked for. Rowan Dynamics was my father's life work, and after his sudden death, 3 months prior, the company became a heavy suit of armor I wore every day. My inherited responsibility was immense. My goal was merely preservation. I stood at the head of the long, slept, reflective glass conference table in our San Francisco headquarters, trying to project a confidence I rarely felt alone. The directors of the board watched me, their faces grim shadows reflected in the polished surface. The air was thick with tension, not just because of the restructuring plan I was laying out, but because of the instability my father's absence had created. Internally, I was exhausted in ways I couldn't articulate, fighting the constant paranoia that someone was waiting for me to fail. Just as I was summarizing the quarterly projections, the doors slammed open with a violent shudder, the glass rattling loudly in its frame. Selene walked in first. Her heels struck the marble floor, with deliberate, staccato clicks, announcing her presence like an unwelcome fanfare. She was followed by Jace, her new husband, whose smug, self-satisfied grin made the already uneasy board members visibly shift in their seats. Their arrival was so jarring, so out of place, that the entire room fell into a stunned silence. My stomach twisted into a painful knot. Of all the times, of all the places, they chose this pivotal moment to confront me. Selene marched straight to the table and threw a manila folder down in front of me. The papers inside fanned out like an official accusation. "We're here for what's ours," she announced, her voice slicing through the thick air. "Half of Rowan Dynamics. Half of your $500 million company." She used my father's name with a false familiarity that tightened my jaw. I looked her dead in the eye, determined to keep my voice steady and cold despite the rising heat in my chest. "You're not getting anything." Jace stepped forward, his smug confidence shifting to naked aggression. "Your father made assurances," he insisted, leaning toward me. "Real assurances. Maybe he didn't tell you everything." His words struck deeper than I cared to admit. My father despised lies. Yet had he promised her anything? The doubt flickered, brief and potent, and Selene caught it. She smiled, already claiming victory. She turned to leave, dismissing the room as though she were royalty bored with her subjects. As she reached the doors, she tossed a final sentence over her shoulder, delivered with icy certainty. "By tomorrow, Lewis, you won't have anything left to keep." The click of her heels down the hallway sounded like a grim countdown to my downfall. The directors avoided my gaze, returning to their papers with forced concentration. The meeting had been derailed entirely. The paranoia I had been fighting since his death now felt completely justified. The moment Selene and Jace vanished, the corporate facade I had struggled to maintain shattered. I couldn't return to the agenda, not with that corrosive threat hanging in the air. All I could think about was her chilling certainty. What was she basing her claim on? I needed to get away from the stifling scrutiny of the city. I drove south from San Francisco, taking the coastal highway towards Santa Cruz. The ocean usually grounded me, its vastness and permanence a welcome contrast to the volatile corporate world. That night, however, it only magnified my sense of isolation. The endless expanse of dark water felt like a physical reflection of how empty the world was without my father in it. I kept replaying his voice, his mannerisms, trying to find a clue he might have left me. When I finally pulled into the driveway of the old Rowan estate, the silence wrapped around me like a painful memory. The house still smelled faintly of his familiar cologne. It had always been his sanctuary, a place where it's only entered in the form of a folded newspaper. Tonight, it felt less like a home and more like an untouched monument. I walked toward the greenhouse behind the main house. It was humid and warm inside, glowing softly beneath strings of lights my father had hung himself years ago. He had spent decades nurturing rows of rare plants and orchids here. When the rest of the house slept, because I needed to feel close to him, needed the illusion of his presence to counteract the crippling paranoia that had set in. I stepped carefully between the humid aisles, the scent of damp earth and exotic blossoms heavy in the air. I didn't expect to find anything. The idea that he would leave a breadcrumb trail seemed too dramatic, too cinematic. But as my eyes swept across a workbench beneath a shelf of orchids, I saw something tucked beneath a heavy ceramic pot. It was a yellowed envelope, and on the front, my name was written in his looping, unmistakable handwriting. My breath caught in my chest as I read the phrase written beneath my name. Lewis. Open when the wolves start circling. He had used that metaphor my entire childhood to describe people. The polite, smiling predators, who only showed up when they sensed an opportunity. Selene had always fit that description perfectly, even before our messy breakup. The phrase was a punch to the gut, a recognition that he had known this danger was coming long before his death. Inside the envelope, I found two items: a small tarnished brass key and a handwritten letter. I unfolded the letter, my hands shaking. My father's voice played clearly in my mind as I read his steady, pragmatic words. He wrote that he had suspected someone would try to destabilize the company immediately following his death. He instructed me to use the key to open the safe, hidden behind a bookshelf in his study. Then came the part that stole the air from my lungs and instantly triggered the worst of my emotional conflict. He warned me not to trust anyone. The final line of the paragraph read, "Not even Ember. Ember, my younger brother. The last person I thought my father would ever caution me against." The suspicion felt like a physical sickness. Betrayal from Ember was incomprehensible. It didn't make sense, unless there was a colossal, hidden truth I had completely overlooked. The doubt surrounding my brother was a devastating pivot, forcing me to recognize the threat wasn't just external anymore. It was personal, corrosive, and familial. The greenhouse suddenly felt cold, despite the tropical warmth. I clutched the key and the letter, the initial content of my father's warning, replaced by an isolating wave of confusion and sharp, painful paranoia. The wolves were here. And if his warning was true, one of them wore the face of my own brother. I knew I couldn't wait until morning. I had to go to the study, and I had to open that safe now. Carrying the weight of my father's final warning, I moved quickly from the greenhouse to his study. The room was dark, lit only by the sliver of moonlight filtering through the tall windows. His scent, leather and old paper, was heavy here. I found the hidden safe behind a rotating bookshelf, just as he had described, and the small brass key fit perfectly into the lock. The safe door swung open, revealing not a stack of cash or legal papers, but a carefully curated time capsule of suspicion. This was not about protecting money. This was about laying a trap. My hands trembled as I pulled out the contents, spreading the evidence across the mahogany desk. I found an SSD loaded with encrypted files, a USB drive, and a stack of photographs. The photograph showed Selene and Jace meeting with shadowy figures they had no business knowing. There were also records of bank transfers, dated during the months my father was weakest, months when Selene had claimed to visit purely out of compassion. The chill deepened as I watched a short video clip on the SSD. It showed Selene handing an envelope to the nurse who had cared for my father in his last weeks. Clearly a bribe. The forged contract had my brother Ember's signature on it, a document relating to the sale of some internal patents. That sight alone brought bile into my throat. The betrayal felt monumental, immediate. My father's warning wasn't just paranoia, it was prophecy. The intense, personal conflict of not being able to trust my own brother completely overwhelmed the corporate threat. Then I found the last photograph, the one that truly froze my breath. It was a grainy image of Ember standing outside a seaside cafe with Selene. He was passing her a folder, one I recognized instantly from my father's business archives. The floor seemed to tilt. Had Ember been conspiring with her all along? Was he the inside man who gave Selene the certainty she needed to issue that chilling threat in the meeting? I stared at the collection of secrets spread out before me. My father, with his hatred of deception, had built this complex maze of evidence. He prepared for everything except telling me the full truth while he was alive, which only intensified my feeling of isolation. Standing there, surrounded by proof of familial deceit, one realization settled like stone. I wasn't just fighting Selene. I was stepping into a war my father started years ago. And the wolf was closer than I ever imagined. It was shortly after 3 o'clock in the morning. I was still sitting at the desk, lost in the shadows and the weight of my findings, when my phone screen flashed brightly. I grabbed it, half expecting an email from an overseas partner. Instead, Selene's name glowed across the screen. The text message was short, devoid of punctuation, and dripping with gleeful malice. "Would burned your company down." For a moment, I forgot how to draw breath. My entire body locked. Immobilized by a wave of pure, visceral rage and despair. All the carefully collected evidence blurred into nothing. All I could see was my father's legacy. His life's work, swallowed in flames and turned to ash, because of someone I had once trusted enough to love, and someone I had been too blind to recognize as a threat. My own brother. My heartbeat hammered against my ribs, loud and frantic. I grabbed the keys and tore out of the driveway, speeding north toward Highway 1. The darkness outside felt absolute, lit only by the desperate sweep of my headlights. I drove, frantic and shaking, convinced the worst had happened. That everything my father built was destroyed. The drive north on Highway 1 was a blur of frantic speed and internal agony. The silence of the night shattered by the frantic pounding of my heart. All the evidence I had just uncovered. The bribes, the forged signatures, suddenly meant nothing if the core of my father's legacy was now in ruins. I kept hearing his voice from the letter, his warning that someone would try to destroy what he left behind. As I neared Monterey, a sickening orange glow began to stain the pre-dawn sky. My fears crystallized into a devastating reality when I finally turned onto the industrial road where the old Rowan facility used to stand. Flames towered into the air, reaching as high as the warehouses themselves. The fire department was already there, battling the massive blaze, water spraying against the collapsing structure with loud hisses. I stepped out of the car and just stood there, feeling the intense heat on my face. A lifetime of memories flooded me. My father leaning over prototype stations, his pride in the first energy cells built here. Watching it dissolve into a blackened, smoking skeleton was a pain almost too sharp to bear. But as I watched the firefighters work, something tugged at the back of my mind. A detail that didn't fit, a piece of the puzzle that was just wrong. The industrial road was the right one, and the building was definitely burning, yet something about the structure's dimensions and its location felt off. I took a slow, deliberate look around the charred perimeter, forcing myself to use my CEO eyes. That's when I saw it. The sign for Rowan Dynamics was missing. My father had quietly sold this specific property nearly 2 years ago. I remembered the internal paperwork now. He had divested of this particular asset long before his death. A wave of disbelief washed over me, immediately followed by something sharp and dangerously close to hysterical relief. They hadn't burned down my company. They had burned down someone else's property entirely. I began to laugh. A hollow, disbelieving sound that started low in my chest and broke out into the cold morning air. At a meeting, my ex and her husband stormed in. "We'll want half of your $500 million company," I said. "You're not getting anything." The next morning, they boasted. "We burned your company down." I rushed over, and I laughed. The building they torched was actually a stranger's. Just as the relief settled, my phone buzzed again. A video message from Selene. I tapped play. There she stood with Jace, triumphantly framed by the roaring inferno. Certain they had won. "You won't rise from this," she screamed over the crackling flames, her face vicious with assumed victory. "This is the end for you, Lewis." Her malicious smile, meant to crush me, was instead a gift. It was clear, undeniable, and voluntarily filmed evidence of property destruction, criminal intent, and collusion. My father's strategy snapped into focus. Don't trust what they do at the surface. They're more foolish than you think. He hadn't just prepared me for the fight, he had anticipated their monumental overconfidence. Standing there, slept, watching the last stubborn flames extinguished by the firefighters, I realized that the attack meant to destroy me had instead armed me. Their mistake had given me the leverage I needed to turn the entire situation on its head. This was no longer a defensive battle for my father's legacy. It was a prosecutorial war. I left Monterey, knowing that the external conflict had resolved itself, not by my action, but by their catastrophic, vicious mistake. Now I finally had a plan. By the time I returned to the Santa Cruz estate, the sky was skimming the edges of gray light. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. My mind was spinning too fast, processing the relief of the fire mistake alongside the crushing weight of my father's warnings. I spread the collection of evidence, the photos, the drives, the documents, across the workbench in the greenhouse, hoping that arranging them would somehow force the full truth to show itself. The only piece of evidence that stood out, painful and accusatory, was the photograph of Ember with Selene. That image, coupled with my father's written caution, had rooted deep inside me, blossoming into a doubt I desperately did not want to acknowledge. I didn't hear the greenhouse door click open, only realizing I was no longer alone when Ember stepped fully inside. He carried the fatigue of someone who had been driving or awake all night. But still, my first reaction was a cold flash of suspicion. I looked past his tired expression straight to the photograph of him and Selene, sliding it across the workbench toward him. "Explain this," I demanded, keeping my voice low and flat. Ember didn't move for a long moment. He sank into the chair opposite me and picked up the picture. I watched his expression shift. Not guilty, but profoundly wary. as though he had been waiting for this confrontation for months. He admitted, quietly, that he had met with Selene more than once during our father's final months. I wanted to unleash the anger that had been building since reading my father's letter. I wanted to accuse him of being a greedy traitor. But I swallowed the impulse, forcing myself to maintain the cold professionalism I used in the boardroom. I simply waited for him to continue. Ember told me he hadn't been working with her. He had been playing along to gather information. Our father had suspected Selene was attempting to manipulate the company's internal structure, especially after she began spending more time around him under the guise of emotional support. My father knew she had ulterior motives, and, wanting confirmation, he had asked Ember to be the bait. Hearing that my father had trusted Ember with such a critical, deceptive task while leaving me entirely in the dark left a sour ache beneath my ribs. I felt shut out of my own family's war, seen as too emotional or too impulsive to handle the deception. Why didn't he tell me? Was all I could manage to say. The question a raw plea. Ember hesitated. He explained that our father had wanted to protect me from acting rashly, from letting my history with Selene cloud my judgment. He didn't want me pulled into something that required the surveillance and manipulation that Ember's role required. He feared I would become the person I had been when Selene had first destroyed me years ago. It hurt more than I expected to hear that my father saw me as someone who needed shielding, someone whose emotions could jeopardize an entire operation. But Ember wasn't finished. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a small USB drive. "This is from Dad," he said. He asked me to hold on to it. I plugged the drive into my laptop, and my father's voice filled the warm, humid air of the greenhouse. He sounded tired, but his tone was steady and painfully aware of his limited time. He spoke directly to Ember, saying he knew I would misinterpret their meetings, that I would see betrayal where there was only necessary protection. He asked Ember to endure my suspicion, to stay silent until the right moment arrived. My eyes burned as I leaned back, the crushing guilt of my distrust settling heavily inside me. The distance that had grown between us dissolved in that moment. Ember had been enduring my paranoia, not causing it. Then, a second recording played from the USB. It was Selene's voice, harsh and demanding, pressuring a doctor to revise notes about my father's mental state near the end of his life. She wanted documentation to later claim he had not been of sound mind while adjusting his will. Hearing her use his illness, his vulnerability, as leverage knocked the breath out of me. This was an assault on his dignity, not just his assets. I shut the laptop. That realization hardened something essential inside me. I looked at Ember. "We're ending this at the will reading," I declared. He simply nodded. We were no longer two brothers, circling secrets and suspicion. We were standing on the same side at last. For the first time since my father died, I felt ready. Not just to defend what he left me, but to expose everything he fought so fiercely to keep hidden, until the exact right moment. I had taken the first necessary step toward embracing vulnerability by trusting my brother again. With the devastating internal conflict finally resolved, the strategy became clear: use Selene and Jace's arrogance against them. We knew the date of the will reading was set, and we now had the irrefutable evidence we needed for the confrontation. I drove to the actual Rowan Dynamics headquarters in Silicon Valley. The building felt tense, buzzing with worried energy. Word about the Monterey fire had spread online, and employees whispered nervously in the lobby. I walked through the crowd, speaking in a steady, calm voice, assuring them that the company remained untouched and operations were secure. The relief on their faces was palpable, but it was underlined by a heavy, communal anger that someone had tried to bring down the whole enterprise. I went straight to the security division and asked them to pull every available angle of footage from the area around the old, burned warehouse. Within the hour, I was standing over a cluster of monitors, watching the smug, triumphant parade of Selene and Jace against the backdrop of the towering flames. They filmed themselves laughing and proclaiming my ruin. The spectacle was so absurd it was almost unbelievable. But then, my attention snagged on something else. In the far left corner of one grainy frame, partly obscured by smoke and flames, a man stood back in the shadows. He wasn't celebrating or panicking. He stood like someone assessing damage. Someone waiting. His posture was familiar in a way that made my skin tighten with immediate recognition. I leaned closer to the monitor. The footage was poor quality, but the silhouette was unmistakable. Marshall Crane. He had been our director of operations years ago, fired by my father for siphoning resources into shell accounts. Marshall had vanished after his termination, leaving behind a trail of debt and deceit. My father had always warned me, Marshall would return to settle a score. The realization lodged itself in my mind, like a stone. Selene and Jace weren't the masterminds. They were merely tools. Back in my office, I returned to the files my father had hidden in the safe, now looking for any link to Marshall. Among the papers, I found a detailed folder outlining a property acquisition I had never heard him discuss. A second, fully secured headquarters purchased quietly and transferred under a separate corporate entity. That was the building I was currently standing in. Slept. He had moved the operational core long before his death, anticipating risks I hadn't even imagined. He built a silent shield, protecting the company from attack, both from the outside and, crucially, from people like Marshall on the inside. Hidden deeper in the documents was a string of email archives detailing Selene's communication with a technology competitor in San Jose. They had been planning a buyout disguised as a rescue package, scheduled to go into motion only if Rowan Dynamics faced public collapse or severe legal turmoil. They had been prepared to swoop in the moment we were vulnerable. My father had even entertained an offer from that competitor months before his death, but only, I realized, to expose their full intentions. He had played the long game, drawing them into showing their hand, a move Selene must have learned about and assumed she could leverage for her own benefit. Ember joined me that afternoon and played his final recording. Selene had cornered him, insisting he sign a document stating our father was mentally unfit. Ember had refused, recording the exchange, and then passed the files to our father. The more pieces fell into place, the more it became clear. This was not a simple power grab orchestrated by a scorned ex. Someone with technical savvy and a deep vendetta was pulling the strings. Selene was only the face of the problem. The real danger was Marshall Crane, the shadowy figure from the video, the person who knew how to operate from the depths. Ember and I sat across from each other that night, the desk covered in files, recordings, and photographs. The battle was no longer just about defending the company. It was about honoring the staggering depth of our father's foresight. If Selene walked into the will reading expecting victory, she would walk into something entirely different. We were going to expose everything. I felt focused, determined, and finally, strategically ready for the coming confrontation. The morning of the will reading was a cold, piercing day, The kind of Costa chill that seemed to seep directly into the bone. The chosen location was a private estate, perched high on a cliff in Carmel Highlands, overlooking a restless ocean. The sound of waves slamming into the rocks below echoed through the stone walls as I walked toward the meeting chamber. It felt less like a legal event and more like walking into the heart of a pre-set storm. Inside, our attorney Marlo Vega greeted me with a firm, silent nod. She had been fully briefed on the evidence and knew exactly what lay ahead. Ember stood silently on my left, steady and present. For a brief moment, the immense weight of my father's absence pressed down on my shoulders, but the solidarity with my brother helped me hold firm. Then the heavy wooden doors swung open for the performance. Selene swept in, wearing a shimmering dress, followed by Jace, a cameraman, and a woman holding a microphone. They had brought media to capture their moment of false triumph. Selene announced loudly to the room that she was there to reclaim what she believed was hers, her voice bright, confident, and entirely rehearsed. She clearly had no idea she was walking into a trap. Before the reading could officially begin, Selene stepped forward and handed Marlo a sealed envelope, claiming it contained a true copy of my father's will, granting her 30% of Rowan Dynamics. Marlo opened the document, scanned it once, and without saying a word, set the envelope aside. The document was a poor forgery, the notary date false, the formatting wrong. Selene's confident smile faltered for the first time. Jace immediately jumped into the vacuum of silence, threatening an aggressive lawsuit and accusing me of withholding assets. He spoke loudly, clearly for the benefit of the cameras, but his bravado only served to reinforce how utterly clueless they were about the depth of the trap. I said nothing, letting them talk, letting them dig their hole deeper. It was exactly as Ember and I had planned. When the reading officially commenced, Marlo turned on the large monitor at the head of the table. The first video played, the roaring flames from the Monterey warehouse fire. There stood Selene and Jace, celebrating, calling my name in triumph. Their faces were unmistakable, their voices loud and proud, recorded against the backdrop of an undeniable crime. The room went silent. Even the hired media crew slowly lowered their cameras, unsure of what they were witnessing. Selene's expression collapsed, her victorious facade shattering into raw shock. Jace took a nervous step back, as if physical distance could somehow erase the video evidence. Before either of them could utter a denial, two officers entered the room. They held a warrant tied to property destruction, citing the video evidence. Slept. The look on Selene's face, when she realized she had celebrated the destruction of a stranger's building, not mine, was the final, devastating blow. She tried to bolt, but the next video started playing, stopping her cold. My father appeared on the screen, older and tired, but his clarity was undeniable. He explained that if his message was being seen, it meant someone had tried to interfere with his final wishes. Slept, he confirmed that he was entirely sound of mind while drafting the actual will, and detailed the precautions he took to ensure any attempts at forgery or manipulation would be immediately exposed. Around the table, no one breathed. Selene's knees buckled. Jace, seeing his own fate sealed, instantly turned on her. "She forced me into it," he shouted, wildly claiming he hadn't known what she planned. But Ember stepped forward and played the recording from his USB, featuring Jace discussing their arrangement and his own specific demands in explicit detail. The collapse of their alliance was absolute, leaving them with nothing to stand on but their own exposed lies. As the officers led them away, The room was so quiet I could hear the rhythmic roar of the waves outside once more. Reporters whispered frantically. Marlowe closed the final folder. Ember put a steady hand on my shoulder. The immediate, chaotic threat had ended, and the external conflict was won. Yet, I knew the battle wasn't finished. Marshall Crane, the shadowy architect, was still out there, unrevealed to the public. As I stepped out onto the cliffside walkway, the wind carried the scent of salt water and rain. Today had brought public vindication, but the book wasn't closed. It had only turned the page toward the final confrontation. Driving back to Santa Cruz, after the chaos at Carmel Highlands, I felt like I was trying to hold myself together with shaking hands. Selene and Jace were finished, publicly exposed, and legally detained. But the lingering presence of Marshall Crane, the true architect of the sabotage, was a dark thread I couldn't cut. The focus of the fight shifted entirely to him. A few hours later, my security team sent an encrypted file labeled with urgency. They had digitally enhanced the grainy footage from the Monterey fire until the shadowy silhouette resolved into a clear face. Marshall Crane. This confirmation was the final, sickening twist. My father had always warned me about Marshall, the disgraced former director, who had vanished after being fired for theft. Ember found me staring at the screen. He sat down and quietly revealed the last secret his father entrusted him with. After Marshall's termination, my father suspected Marshall was leaking advanced technology designs and asked Ember to track his movements. Ember confirmed that Marshall was working with overseas buyers, positioning himself to dismantle Rowan dynamics from the inside. Selene hadn't been the mastermind. She had been Marshall's access point, a tool he leveraged using her resentment and history with me. His goal was not financial gain from the will, but the complete destruction of the legacy. Before we could form a plan to pursue him, a call came from the sheriff's office. Marshall had slipped out of the state only hours after Selene's arrest, indicating he was running a much larger, pre-played Operation. The dread that moved through me was the recognition that this man had been waiting for years for the right moment to strike. The next morning, Selene requested to speak to me from the holding facility. Marlowe and Ember joined me. Selene was broken, her confident facade utterly gone. She confessed everything. Marshall had threatened her with old, private footage, and had coached her on how to approach my father during his final weeks. She admitted he had known about the will before it was rewritten, hoping to seize proof to discredit my father posthumously. She was nothing more than Marshall's disposable entry key. I returned home and dug into the SSD my father left. In a hidden folder, I found a final video recorded during his last week. My father looked exhausted, but his voice was unwavering. He explained how he discovered Marshall selling proprietary designs and how he had started laying traps long before his illness slowed him down. He predicted Marshall would strike after his death, knowing the only way to protect the company was to ensure the truth surfaced at the right moment. Hearing him slept with such clarity, knowing he planned all of this while fighting for his life, solidified my respect and love for him. With everything, the audio, the footage, the investigative trail, compiled, I sent copies to the state investigators and federal authorities. Marshall Crane was immediately placed on a nationwide alert. The puzzle board finally settled into place. My father had seen farther than any of us. The morning of the press conference rose bright and cold, a clear Silicon Valley day. Standing on the rooftop terrace of our true headquarters, I looked down at the employees who had weathered the rumors and threats. My father taught me to face storms head on, and now I was ready. I stepped up to the podium and told them everything. I showed the footage of Selene and Jace burning the wrong building, the recording of Selene bribing the nurse, and the investigation into Marshall Crane. Finally, I played my father's last video. His voice steady as he explained the precise steps he had taken to protect both the company and the truth. All doubt in the room evaporated, and my father's name emerged spotless. Just as I finished speaking, an agent approached Marlowe and whispered the final confirmation. Marshall had been arrested at a border checkpoint while attempting to flee into Mexico. The news sealed the final chapter of the threat. Selene, who cooperated, earned reduced charges, but still faced consequences for destruction and fraud. Jace, who tried to blame her, faced harsher penalties for embezzlement. Their fall was absolute. That evening, back in the greenhouse, I found a small, brittle envelope behind the largest orchid pot. Inside was a final note written in my father's unmistakable hand. If you found this, Lewis, it means you finally understand. Remember, anger clouds judgment. What I leave you is not a company. It is the ability to rise when everything else falls. Beneath the note was a thin file describing a clean energy project he had never disclosed. A design meant to give low-income communities access to affordable power. It was his quiet, unfinished dream. Reading it felt like discovering the real, selfless heart of who he had been all along. In the following days, I restructured Rowan Dynamics, centering our purpose on that project. I shifted research funding toward community-driven tech and created a grant for young engineers. I asked Ember to serve as vice president. Our partnership finally restored, and stronger than ever. Standing alone in the greenhouse one evening, watching the sunset filter through the rows of orchids, I realized the ultimate truth. Selene, Jace, and Marshall hadn't truly threatened the foundation of what my father built. The foundation was not concrete or patents. It was the resilience and the integrity he had instilled in me. I had walked through betrayal, doubt, and danger, but I had made it to the other side, transformed in the ways my father hoped I would be. The chapter of revenge was closed. What began instead was something far greater, a new life, shaped not by what was stolen from me, but by what I chose to build on my own terms.